I have been to a good many black tie evenings in my life. 31 years processing arrivals at the border will cure a man of any lingering tendency toward awe. You read faces for a living. You learn, quickly, that the ones who carry themselves with the most weight are often carrying the least, and that the ones who slip through quietly are the ones worth watching. By the time I retired, I could clock a man's intentions from 40 feet away, in a crowded terminal, through 2 panes of smudged glass. I say this not to recommend myself, but to explain why I am perhaps not the most obvious person to tell this particular story. I am not a music lover. I have never studied an instrument. I cannot name you the difference between a sonata and a concerto without first guessing wrong. What I can do, what I spent 3 decades doing, is watch a room and tell you exactly when something changes inside it. The evening of the 22nd of October began the way those evenings always begin, with a great deal of noise that is really a great deal of effort, dressed up as ease. The Alderton Grand Hotel had given over its ballroom to the Regional Arts Trust for the autumn fundraising concert. 65 guests in black tie, the round tables set with the kind of candles that managed to flatter everybody present, and cost more than most people spend on a week's shopping. I was there as a civic trustee, which is a title that means you have retired, and the institution wishes to keep using your name on its letterhead in exchange for your attendance at dinners. I did not mind. The food was always good, and I have spent enough years in rooms full of strangers to be perfectly comfortable in them. I arrived early, as is my habit. Punctuality, after 3 decades at a border post, is less a virtue than a reflex, an inability to conceive of being anywhere other than exactly where one is supposed to be, exactly when one is supposed to be there. The banqueting staff were still placing glasses when I came in. I chose a seat at a round table near the back of the ballroom, in the position I always select when I have a choice. Facing outward, sight lines clear in both directions, sufficient distance from the stage to see both the performer and the audience. At Borders, you learn early that the most important thing is not what is in front of you, but what is on both sides of what is in front of you. The room tells you more than any single person in it ever can. The grand ballroom of the Alderton Grand Hotel is one of those rooms that still, despite everything, manages to look like what it is. A room built to hold a certain kind of occasion, with a certain kind of grace. The ceiling is high and coffered in plasterwork that someone, a long time ago, spent considerable time on. The chandeliers are the originals, electrified in the 60s and never replaced, and they cast the particular warm and slightly amber light that no modern fitting has ever successfully reproduced. At the far end of the room, on a shallow dais, there was a Steinway grand piano, concert size, polished to a depth that the candlelight pooled in its lid like a small inland lake. It had been tuned that afternoon. I know this because I arrived early enough to hear the tuner finish and close his bag. The guests arrived across the next 40 minutes, and they arrived the way people in that category always arrive, in 2s and 4s. Not too late and not too early, with the calibrated punctuality of the social class that has internalized the importance of seeming effortless. The men in black tie and the women in the particular gowns that Alderton's constituency of wealth considers appropriate for an arts fundraiser, expensive, tasteful, and legible as such from across the room. I watched them arrive, and I watched them find their tables, and I watched them begin the performance of finding one another interesting, which is the true purpose of every black tie evening, and which everyone present understands, and no one acknowledges. The featured performer that evening was a visiting concert pianist of considerable reputation, a man whose name appeared on the printed program in lettering a third larger than anything else on the page, including the name of the trust itself. I had looked him up before attending, out of the same reflex that had me checking the identities of all arrivals before they reached my desk. He was, by the program's accounting, one of the foremost concert pianists of his generation, a man who had performed at the major halls of 4 continents, and whose recordings had won awards I could not evaluate the significance of. He was, by the arrangement of his name on that program, the reason 65 people had paid a good deal of money to attend an October dinner in a hotel ballroom in Alderton. Sir Aldous Fenwick was working the room when I arrived. He was the patron of the evening, a large, white-haired man of 66, with a tan that suggested he had recently been somewhere warmer, and the kind of expansive, enveloping social manner that takes years of careful practice to make seem effortless. He moved through the gathering guests like a man at home in his own house, pressing flesh and dispersing approval in roughly equal measure. I had encountered him twice before, at similar events, different causes, and my assessment of him, formed over those two brief acquaintances, was that he was a man who had been important for long enough that it had ceased to occur to him to examine whether he deserved to be. He dispensed patronage the way very large rivers dispense water, continuously, confidently, without pausing to consider the country it passes through. He had been important in the music world, specifically, for a long time. He had backed careers. He had funded concert halls and bursary programs and competition prizes. His name was on a rehearsal wing at the Alderton Conservatory and on the lobby wall of a regional chamber orchestra. He spoke about music with the authority of a man who had paid for a great deal of it, which is a different kind of authority from the kind that comes from having made any, but which tends to be accepted in the rooms where these things are decided. I watched him for a while, as I do in those situations, and I noted that he had positioned himself, I am sure unconsciously. This kind of positioning becomes instinctive, so that he was always at the center of whichever conversation he was in, and always visible from the rest of the room. A man who has spent a career being looked at, whether he is performing or not, acquires a certain spatial orientation. He always knows, without checking, where the eyes of the room are, and he places himself accordingly. At 7:30, the hotel's banqueting manager appeared at his elbow. I noticed the conversation because I am constitutionally incapable of not noticing a conversation that matters, and this one clearly mattered. Giles, I learned his name later, was a young man of perhaps 28, pale and tidy in his hotel livery, with the slightly harried efficiency of someone who has managed events long enough to have developed a genuine respect for the ways in which they can go wrong. He spoke to Fenwick with the careful brevity of a man delivering news he has already mentally rehearsed, and Fenwick listened with the stillness of a man whose large social mechanism has suddenly been asked to recalculate. The news, as I subsequently learned, was this. The featured pianist had been taken ill at his hotel. Something sudden, his agent said. Nothing serious. But he could not perform that evening. He was sorry. Giles had already called the agency and the trust's program director, and neither had a solution. I watched Fenwick's face move through several expressions in approximately 5 seconds. Surprise, which he controlled quickly. Irritation, which he allowed himself briefly. Calculation, which he suppressed but which I recognized. And then, settling over all of it, the particular expression of a powerful man who has decided that what has just happened is, in fact, not going to be a problem, because he is going to manage it. It is a specific look. I have seen it at immigration desks, when someone realizes that the difficulty they are in is nevertheless navigable. The difference, on those occasions, was that the person at my desk was usually correct. He patted Giles on the arm, the pat of a man who has concluded the conversation, and then raised his voice just enough to reach all 4 corners of the room. A small change to our arrangements, he announced, and the room quieted around him, the way rooms do when the largest presence in them speaks. Our friend on the program has been taken unwell this evening. Nothing serious, I'm assured. And so we shall adjust. Not to worry. These things happen. We shall have a splendid evening regardless. A pause, timed well, to let the ripple of concerned murmuring settle. I dare say we'll improvise. He said it with the confidence of a man who has never found improvisation difficult, because he has always had sufficient resources to make improvising trivially easy. I watched the room receive this reassurance and begin the process of recalibrating, the disappointed faces softening, the glasses raised again, the conversations resuming with the slightly diminished energy of 65 people deciding to make the best of it. One of the women at the adjacent table said something to her husband that I couldn't hear, but his expression in response was the expression of a man who has spent good money and is privately, with some effort, taking the longer view. Fenwick moved through the room again, but differently now, purposefully, his eyes doing the thing they do in a situation that requires solving. He spoke to the trust's program director near the stage, and that conversation went badly. I could read it from the body language, because there was no obvious solution there. He spoke to the hotel's resident pianist, who apparently was not available or not adequate. He moved toward the stage and looked at the Steinway with the expression of a man confronting a problem he cannot resolve by throwing money at it in the next 4 minutes. which was a new experience for him by the look of it. And that is when I saw the woman with the linen trolley. She appeared in the wide service entrance at the far end of the ballroom, the doors with the brass handles that the staff used when they needed to move things in and out of the room without passing through the main entrance. A small, compact woman in a gray hotel uniform, her hair pinned neatly back with a clip, pushing a trolley loaded with folded white linens. She must have come to restock the side tables before the meal service began, or to retrieve something she had left on an earlier round, or simply because the route of her work brought her through that door at that time, and she had not been told about the adjustment to the evening's arrangements. She stopped when she saw the assembled guests. I watched her do it, the slight arrest of momentum, the brief recalibration. Not embarrassment, not the panic you sometimes see when someone in a service role finds themselves unexpectedly in a social space they were not expecting to enter. Something quieter than that. Consideration. She was looking at the room with the composed, assessing manner of a person who has walked into situations that require adjustment before, and who has learned to take the measure of them before doing anything. She was, I would estimate, in her late 50s, 58, I later learned, which was not far off. A woman of Indonesian heritage, slight, but with a quality of compactness that is not the same as smallness, the kind of physical economy that comes from years of work that requires precision and control of the body. Her face was composed to the point of stillness, which is not the same as blankness. It was the face of someone capable of expression, but currently choosing not to deploy any. Her hotel uniform was pressed with the exactness of someone who is accustomed to pressing things to a standard. I noticed her hands on the trolley handle, large hands for a woman of her frame, large across the palm, with the slightly raised knuckle profile of hands that have been doing sustained physical work for a long time. Hands that told a certain story about how a person spent their days. The kind of hands that do not belong in an immigration officer's risk category. The kind of hands I had seen on teachers, on craftsmen, on people who made things with precision over long periods of time. And I noted it at the time, and I have thought about it many times since, that when she stopped in the doorway and took in the room, her eyes moved, briefly but unmistakably, to the Steinway on the dais, not to Fenwick, who was the largest and most visible element of the room, not to the guests who were the most numerous, not to the exit, which would have been the natural destination for a person intending to retreat, to the piano. A flicker, a second, perhaps less, and then her eyes moved back to the room at large, and she did not move. Fenwick saw her. He had been circling toward the dais, and he turned, and his eyes found her with the speed of a man who has been looking for a solution and has just landed on something that might, in a pinch, serve as one. I recognized the look not because I had seen it used on a person in a hotel doorway before, but because I had seen it used many times at checkpoints and desks on the people who are moving through, when someone in authority spots a particular face in a queue and makes a decision about it. The look of instrumental regard. The look of a use being found. He smiled, and it was a good smile, genuinely warm in its delivery, which is part of what made him effective over all those years. He gestured toward her with an openness that included the whole room in the joke, a showman's move. Splendid. Since our musical friend has let us down this evening, he kept his voice carrying, warm, projecting the magnanimity of the powerful man, graciously condescending to include the help in his evening. Perhaps one of our hotel's excellent staff might step in and oblige us. Just a simple tune, something cheerful to fill the gap while we sort things out properly. He beamed at the room, and the room, as rooms do when Fenwick smiled back. A ripple of appreciative noise, 65 people receiving the joke, the generous eccentricity of the suggestion, the mild entertainment of seeing where this would go. What do you say? Can you play for us? He was speaking to Marta Sundaram. I watched her face. The room was watching too now, the kind of collective attention that gathers when something slightly unexpected is offered as entertainment. I have seen that quality of attention before, in queues and terminals, when a situation presents itself that might be amusing. It has a particular texture, benevolent, condescending, already slightly satisfied with itself. 65 people, ready to be charmed or gently amused, absolutely certain of the scale of what was about to happen. Marta Sundaram looked at Fenwick. She looked at the piano. There was a pause, not hesitation, consideration, of perhaps 3 seconds. during which her face showed nothing at all, and then she said, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "A little." She left her trolley precisely where it was. She did not look back at it. She crossed the ballroom. The sound from the room as she walked was exactly the sound I expected. The warm, slightly amused, gently indulgent sound of 65 people preparing to receive a small novelty and be kind about it. One of the women at the nearest table said, in a voice she did not particularly lower, "Oh, how charming," and said it in the register of someone admiring a child's offer to demonstrate a skill. Benevolent, sealed, already quite confident about the dimensions of what it was about to witness. I watched Marta cross the room. She walked the way people walk when they are going somewhere they intend to arrive at, without performance, without hurry, without the slightly tentative quality that rooms of this kind usually induce in people who are not of this kind. She reached the dais. She reached the bench. She set her hands on the sides of the bench and adjusted it, 2 turns of the height knob, clockwise, smooth, without looking at her hands. The movement of someone who has adjusted 1,000 benches and knows exactly where she needs to be. She sat. She placed her palms flat on her thighs for a moment. Not nervousness, settling, the way a craftsman settles before beginning precise work, and looked, briefly, at the keys, not at the music desk, which was empty, at the keys, as though reacquainting herself with something she had not been apart from as long as the room imagined. She placed her hands on the keys. What came from the piano was not what the room expected. It was not the slightly tentative, slightly earnest, would-be pleasant sound that 65 people were braced to receive generously. It was something else entirely, and I am going to try to tell you what happened in the room when it arrived, because the music itself I can only describe with the vocabulary I have, which is the vocabulary of a man who reads faces and spaces, not notes. The first sound she produced from that Steinway was a rolling, low, double-handed phrase, unhurried, entirely assured, and I saw, in the same moment, a man at the nearest table set his champagne glass down. He did not do this deliberately. His hand simply opened, and the glass came to rest on the tablecloth, and he did not look at it, because his face had turned toward the piano, with an expression he had not been wearing a moment before. Marta Sundaram was playing the opening of the Brahms Piano Concerto No. 2 in B-flat major. I know this now. I did not know it then. I knew only what I was observing, that the room was doing something it had not been doing before, that the 65 people who had been arranged in the particular social formation of a black-tie dinner, conversational pairs, the polite distances, the managed faces, were beginning, one by one, and then in small clusters, to change orientation. The woman next to the man who had set down his glass stopped speaking mid-sentence, not because anything interrupted her. No one touched her arm, no one coughed, but because the sentence she was in the middle of had become, in some way she could not have articulated, less important than what was coming from the piano, and she simply did not finish it. The couple near the stage, whom I had watched arrive together, and who had not said much to each other across the dinner table, were both facing the dais now, with the same expression on both their faces. Open, attending, slightly stripped of the social surface that people of their kind wear in rooms of this kind as naturally as they wear their clothes. A man near the window, broad, county council type, I had placed him earlier, had turned his chair bodily to face the stage without appearing to notice that he had done this. And Fenwick. I want to be precise about Fenwick, because precision is what I owe this story. He had been standing, at the moment Marta began to play, in a conversation near the far end of the room, a glass of red wine in his hand, the posture of a man managing the awkwardness of an evening that had not gone as planned. He stopped. He did not stop because the conversation required it. He stopped because something had arrived in the room that stopped him, and for a moment, 3 seconds, 4, he stood with his glass lifted part way, and his face in a configuration I could not immediately interpret, and then his face found an expression I recognized from my years at the desk, the expression of a man who is trying to determine what he is looking at. Not what he is hearing, what he is looking at. The reconsidering of a category. The first movement is, I know now, an extended and demanding thing, architecturally vast, technically complex, requiring a range of tone and touch across the piano's full register that puts the best concert pianists through their paces. I know this because the Alderton Conservatory's senior professor of piano studies told me so, several weeks after the evening, over the course of a conversation that lasted considerably longer than I had anticipated, and that I found I was not willing to cut short. At the time, in the ballroom, I had no vocabulary for what Marta was doing. I had only what I could observe. She played with her eyes open. She played without sheet music, from memory, and without effort in any register I could see. No visible strain in the hands or the body. No leaning into difficult passages with the slight dramatization that amateurs sometimes produce, to indicate to the room that they are aware of the difficulty. She sat at the instrument with the composure of someone who is precisely where they belong, doing precisely what they were made to do, and have known this for a very long time. Her face was not performing. It was not projecting anything outward. It was turned inward, not in the sense of being closed, but in the sense of being engaged with something private and significant, with a degree of attention that simply did not have anything left over for the room. I watched the room, because that is what I do. The noise of conversation was gone. It had not drained away gradually. It had simply stopped, at some point in the first 2 minutes of the first movement, and I had not been able to identify the exact moment it stopped, because it had happened the way daylight changes in autumn. You look up, and it is different, and you cannot say precisely when the change began. 65 people in black tie, and the room was as quiet as a room containing 65 people can be. The small, involuntary sounds of breathing, the faint sound of a chair's smallest movement, the distant noise of the hotel beyond the ballroom doors, all of it background, all of it irrelevant, the way background becomes irrelevant when something in the foreground takes all of it. She played through the first movement, and I watched faces. The man with the county council bearing had his fist pressed lightly to his mouth. I have seen that gesture before. It is the gesture of someone who is holding themselves together by a small but sufficient margin. The woman who had said how charming, I could see her profile, was not smiling. She was still in a way that she had not been still all evening, with her hands in her lap and something in her face that I have seen on the faces of people who have been asked an unexpected question and do not yet have the answer. The Trust's program director, a precise woman in her 50s, who I had placed as someone who managed events without being moved by them, had one hand resting on the tablecloth and was looking at Marta with an expression of concentration so complete that she had entirely stopped being a program director and had become simply a person listening. Giles, the banqueting manager, was motionless in the service doorway, arms at his sides, in the particular stillness of someone who has gone off duty from their own job without deciding to. He was not managing the room. He was not monitoring anything. He was simply there, in the way that a person is simply somewhere when they forget to have a purpose, because something more important is using all of their attention. The first movement ended. I felt it end rather than heard it end, which is the best I can do by way of description. And there was a moment of silence before the second movement began. Not the pause of someone gathering themselves, the pause of someone allowing a door to open. The second movement of the Brahms Piano Concerto No. 2 in B-flat major is, I am told, a thing of a particular and unusual quality. The conservatory professor described it to me as intimate, a word he used carefully, in the sense of its true meaning, interior, private, belonging to the innermost. He said that it is a movement about something that cannot quite be said in any other way, and that when it is played at the highest level, it is not music for a concert hall in the ordinary sense, but something more like a private communication that has been allowed to be overheard. He said this without apparent embarrassment, which told me that he meant it precisely. I can only tell you what it did to the room. The room wept. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that the character of the room changed. The woman with the profiled stillness. I saw her lift a hand to her face, once, quickly, and return it to her lap. The man with the county council bearing, his shoulders were different, lower, the held tension gone, and his face, when I could see it, was not held in any configuration at all. He had stopped managing his face, which is something people very rarely do in rooms of this kind, and which I noticed because I had spent 30 years cataloging the moment when people stop managing their faces. A woman near the stage, gray-haired, elegant, from the table near the honorary officers, had her eyes closed and her chin slightly down, the posture of someone who has found the only comfortable position and intends to remain in it. I did not weep. I am not a weeping man, and this is not something I have ever regarded as a deficiency, though sitting in that ballroom on the 22nd of October is perhaps the only occasion on which I have briefly reconsidered the question. I sat with my hands flat on my thighs, and I listened to what was coming from the Steinway, and I did what I have always done. I tried to understand what I was witnessing. What I was witnessing, I understood then, and understand better now, was this. A person delivering something they have been carrying for a long time, to a room they did not expect to give it to, with a precision and a fullness that makes clear that the carrying has not diminished what was being carried. The music coming from that piano was not approximating something or gesturing towards something. It was the thing itself, complete, nothing withheld, offered without announcement or apology, in a hotel ballroom in Alderton on a Tuesday evening in October. There is a quality to that kind of giving, the giving of a thing that has been held intact over a long time, in difficult circumstances, against the pressure of loss and silence, and the absence of the right room, that I do not have the musicological language to describe, but I have been in rooms where it happens, not often, 3 times perhaps, in 69 years, and each time, I have been aware that what I am watching is not performance, it is delivery, the completion of a long chain of custody, the object finally arriving at its destination. The second movement went on, and the room went deeper into its silence. I thought about a number of things during those minutes, which is unusual for me. I am not a reflective man by temperament, or not during events. I reflect afterward, in the quiet, when I have the material in front of me. But something about the music was producing thought, the way certain atmospheric conditions produce certain kinds of weather, whether you are prepared for them or not. I thought about the bridge on the Alderton Ring Road that I had driven across every morning for 20 years, without ever looking at it. I thought about the craftsman who had built it, alone, in 1934, working from calculations no one else would have troubled to make, producing a structure rated to stand for 300 years, watched by no one, and acknowledged by almost no one in the century since. I thought about what it means to do work of that quality without a room to receive it, whether the bridge is diminished by the fact that no one looks up. I thought, for the first time in my life, that I did not know the answer to this question. The second movement ended. The final chord, sustained, held with the pedal, allowed to dissolve slowly into the air of the room, as though the room itself were absorbing it. And then, silence. Full silence. Not the empty silence of an absence, but the full silence of something that has just been completed, and whose completion the room is still processing. I would estimate that 4 seconds passed before anyone moved. The woman nearest the stage stood first. She rose the way people rise when the decision has already been made somewhere below thought. The body knows before the mind catches up, and she was standing before I believe she had decided to stand. The man beside her followed, and then the woman at the next table, and 2 men from the table beyond, and the motion passed through the room like a slow wave, the gathering of feet and the gathering of sound, the sound of 65 people releasing something they had been holding, without knowing they were holding it. The applause in a room of 65 people is not a small thing when it is the genuine article. It is not a well-done sound, and it is not a thank you sound. It is something more physical than either of those, a collective exhalation, a release, the sound of a room that has been through something together, and is only now finding out how to make a sound about it. I stood with everyone else, because of course I did. You stand for things. It is what standing is for. I want to be exact about Sir Aldous Fenwick. He was the last person in that room to stand, not by a short margin, by a significant one. The rest of us were already on our feet, already producing that sound, and Fenwick was in his chair. I had kept one eye on him throughout the performance, as I keep one eye on everything. And what I had observed was this. He had moved, during the first movement, from the standing position I described, glass raised, reconsidering, to a seated position at one of the tables. He had done this without calling attention to it, which for Fenwick required some management. He was not a man who entered or exited situations quietly. He had sat, and he had remained seated, and his glass had at some point been set down entirely and not retrieved. During the second movement, his face had done something I observed but could not, in the moment, fully read. It was the face of a man who has encountered a thing that has unlocked a door he did not remember leaving shut. Not surprise, exactly. He was not a man whom surprise found easily. Something older than surprise. The face of a man going through his pockets for something he had misplaced and finding, unexpectedly, his hand on something he had not known he had lost. He was looking at Marta while she played, looking at her in the way you look at a face you think you know from somewhere, the reaching quality of a memory that has not quite arrived yet. And then, once, he looked at the piano itself, and then back at her, and I saw a door open in his face, that I do not think he had intended to open, because Fenwick was a man who managed his face as a professional discipline, and this was not managed. He stood. He put his hands together and he stood, at the back of the wave of standing people, and the thing that I will carry from that room is not the sound of the applause, which was real, and which I heard, and which I will not forget, but the quality of Fenwick standing. He stood the way a man stands when standing has cost him something. Not reluctantly, not unwillingly, he stood fully. He applauded with the rest of them, but with a quality that is different from the standing of the rest of the room. The rest of the room was giving. Fenwick was paying. Marta Sundaram sat at the Steinway through the applause. She did not bow. She did not stand. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the piano's music desk, empty throughout, every note from memory, and her face was, as it had been throughout, composed and private, not unmoved, composed. The face of someone who has completed something and is not yet ready to leave the place where they completed it. After 90 seconds, perhaps 2 minutes, she rose. She pushed the bench back to its original position. She reset the height knob before releasing it, 2 turns back, which I noticed, and she crossed the room. The room, standing, moved for her. Not self-consciously, not dramatically. It simply arranged itself so that she could pass, the way a crowd arranges itself for something it has decided to recognize. She returned to her linen trolley in the service doorway. She placed her hands on the handle. She did not look back at the piano. Giles, the banqueting manager, appeared at her shoulder within 30 seconds. He spoke to her quietly. Whatever he said, she considered it and then replied, briefly, and he nodded, and turned, and said something to another member of the hotel staff, and then he returned to her, and gestured toward the service corridor, and she took her trolley, and he escorted her out of the ballroom. I learned later that he had taken her to a private dining room on the 2nd floor, arranged a meal for her, and notified the hotel's duty manager before the main course arrived. Hotels, when they discover something useful, tend to move quickly. The noise of the room when it resumed was different from the noise that had preceded the performance. I can describe it this way. Before, it was the noise of 65 people who had been assembled. Afterward, it was the noise of 65 people who had been assembled, and had then, together, gone through something, and were now the noise of people in the aftermath of that thing. Quieter in some ways, louder in others. More specific, people were not talking about what they usually talk about at these evenings. They were talking about what they had just heard. Patricia, the retired secondary school teacher on my left, a small, sharp-eyed woman I had met twice before at trust functions, leaned toward me during the soup course and said, in a voice that had not entirely recovered its usual crispness, "Who is she?" "I don't know," I said. "Someone should find out," Patricia said. She said it the way she had probably said things in classrooms for 40 years, with the certainty of someone who has decided that a thing is important and who intends to do something about it, even if the thing to be done is simply the assignment of a task. "Don't you think someone should find out?" I said I agreed. And being the kind of man I am, I subsequently did. Her name was Marta Sundaram. She was 58 years old, born in Surabaya, Indonesia. She had come to England 31 years earlier, in the same autumn in which I was completing a career-long project of becoming thoroughly tired of airports, and she had found work in Alderton, and remained. She had been employed at the Alderton Grand Hotel for 19 of those years, laundry presser, then senior laundry technician, floor supervisor, until her knees made the upper floor rounds difficult. And she had given, in all those years, every appearance of being precisely and only what she appeared to be, a quiet, capable woman who did her work with precision and went home. What she had not mentioned to anyone at the hotel in 19 years of employment was that she had studied piano at the Jakarta Conservatory from the age of 9 to the age of 26, under a teacher named Bapa Iwan Hendrawan. I know about Bapa Hendrawan now. I have made it my business to know, over the past 2 years, which has involved conversations I did not anticipate having, and reading materials I would not previously have thought to read, and one visit to Hendrawan's wife, a small, bright-eyed woman of 70, living 12 streets from the hotel where Marta had worked for 19 years, entirely unaware of their proximity. He was, by every account I have gathered, a pianist and teacher of exceptional quality, not famous beyond his field, not a performing name that people outside the Jakarta conservatory community would recognize, but within his field, known with a fervor that is not the usual register for a music teacher, which told me that what he had was genuine. He was known for 2 things. The conservatory professor who agreed to speak with me said, for technical rigor of the highest order, and for understanding what music was for. The professor paused when he said this second thing, as though deciding how much to commit to it, and then committed fully. The best teachers, he said, know what the music is trying to do. Not just how to play it correctly, what it is for. Most people can be taught to play correctly. Very few people can be shown what the music is trying to be. Hendrawan was one of those. He had produced, over a teaching career of 30 years, a cohort of competition winners and performers who spoke of him with a devotion that is unusual in any professional context, and particularly unusual in one as competitive as the music world. He had also made enemies, as anyone who takes up a great deal of space in a competitive world will make enemies. And in the late 1990s, those enemies found a use for the enemies they had made. In the autumn of 1997, a series of rumors began to circulate in conservatory circles. They were specific enough to sound credible, malicious enough to be damaging, and sufficiently untraceable in their origin to be impossible to refute quickly. They concerned the legitimacy of several competition results. They concerned the nature of Hendrawan's professional relationships with certain students. They were untrue. This was established, eventually, by an investigation conducted by the Conservatory Board, which took the better part of a year and arrived at its conclusion too late to be of use to anyone. By the time the investigation cleared him, Hendrawan had already been asked, quietly, with regret, with the language of institutions that cannot afford to be publicly associated with controversy, to take early retirement. He had done so. His student cohort had scattered. Some left the conservatory, some remained but found their association with him professionally uncomfortable to acknowledge. His name had become a conversation that people in the right rooms did not have. He never performed publicly again. He gave no more lessons. He spent 6 years, by his wife's account, in a silence that was not the silence he had chosen. His health, which had been good, was not good in those years. He died in Jakarta in 2003, of a cardiac event, at the age of 64. Marta Sundaram had been his most devoted student. She had studied under him for 17 years. She had, in the autumn of 1997, been preparing for her first significant European performances, the result of years of work, of Hendrawan's patient and meticulous investment in her development, of the slow process by which a gift is cultivated from a raw thing into a finished one. She canceled the performances when the rumors began. She watched the investigation, read what she could, followed it from Surabaya, where she had been visiting family. She had come to England 3 years before the scandal. She had been here since 1994, and when it was over, and her teacher was finished, she did not play in public again. The music stayed inside her. I know this, because his wife told me, over tea, on a February afternoon in her kitchen in Alderton. Marta had kept in contact with the family over the years. Letters, later emails, occasional visits when Mrs. Hendrawan's daughter brought her to England. She had a small, upright electronic keyboard in her flat. She practiced every morning from 6 to 8, alone, because, as Mrs. Hendrawan related, she could not stop. The music was there and it needed to go somewhere, and the only place it was safe to send it was into the quiet of her own flat at 6 in the morning. She had not played for a room since 1997. The piece she played that October evening in the Grand Ballroom, the Brahms Concerto No. 2 in B-flat major, first and second movements, was the piece Bapak Hendrawan had been rehearsing in the week the rumors began. He had been preparing it for a recital that was subsequently cancelled. It was the piece he never finished performing. I have thought about this a great deal. about what it means to carry a thing like that for 20 years. To carry not just the music, but the context of it, the person it was associated with, the loss attached to it, and to keep practicing it alone, for no room, in the early morning quiet, for 20 years. And then to find yourself in a room, not a room you chose, not a room that invited you properly, not a room that knew who you were, but a room, with a piano, and a man who handed it to you as a joke, and to decide, in 3 seconds, to sit down. I asked Marta, some months after the evening, whether she had known that Fenwick was in the room. I asked it carefully, because it was a careful question. She looked at me for a moment, with the composed, assessing gaze I had come to know. Then she said, "I recognized the piano," and that was all she said about it. Sir Aldous Fenwick sought Marta out before the evening was over. The conversation took place near the service corridor, briefly, quietly, without an audience, which was unusual for Fenwick, and told me something. I know what was said, because Giles the banqueting manager was nearby and told me later, and I have no reason to doubt his account. Fenwick stood facing her and looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I knew your teacher." Marta looked at him. "I know," she said. A pause, and then Fenwick said, "He should have played that." He meant the Brahms, he meant the recital, and everything that came after the recital that did not come, and the years of silence, and the death in 2003 at 64. He meant it, I think, as the closest thing available to an acknowledgement, not a confession, not an apology precisely, something harder to name than either of those things, and perhaps more honest. Marta Sundaram looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "He knew he should," and she thanked him for his attention, and she returned to her trolley. There are things that followed that evening that I can tell you about, because they are facts, and there are things I cannot tell you, because I was not there. The Regional Arts Trust met the following month, and voted to offer Marta a recital at the Alderton Concert Hall, a full evening's program, with the Regional Chamber Orchestra if she wished an accompaniment. The proposal was made by Fenwick. He made it at the beginning of the meeting, before the agenda, without preamble, and the board carried it without dissent in about 4 minutes. I know this because Patricia was on the board and called me the same evening. The recital took place the following March. I attended. Patricia attended. Giles the banqueting manager attended, off duty, in his own clothes, and sat in the 4th row. The hall was full, not from marketing, of which there had been a modest amount, but from the way that things travel in a town of Alderton's size, when something has already happened once, and the people who witnessed it have had 4 months to tell the people who did not. Marta played for 2 hours. She played the full Brahms, all 4 movements, with the chamber orchestra, who had rehearsed it with the focused urgency of musicians who have heard, from people they trust, that this is not a situation to be casual about. She played other things in the program's first half, and then, at the end, after the Brahms, she returned to the piano alone and played a final piece that was not on the printed program. I did not know what it was. I could tell from the quality of the room's listening, which was different from its listening to the Brahms, more private, more careful, as though everyone sensed that something more personal was being offered, that this piece was not of the same public architectural quality as the concerto. It was quieter, more interior. It lasted perhaps 12 minutes. I learned afterward, from Mrs. Hendrewan, who was in the concert hall that evening in the front row at Marta's invitation, that the piece was a composition of Bapak Hendrewan's own, something he had written and not published, which existed only in manuscripts that had been kept by his family. Marta had had the manuscript for years. She had memorized it entirely. She had never played it for anyone. It was, Mrs. Hendrewan told me, the thing her husband had been most proud of, and the thing he had been least able to do anything with in his last years. And Marta played it in the Alderton Concert Hall in March, to a full room, from memory, and that was the thing she was giving him. I was in the front row for that piece. I had moved forward at the interval, and I can tell you what I saw. I can tell you that Mrs. Hendrewan, who was very small and very composed in the seat beside me, held herself entirely still throughout those 12 minutes, and did not make a sound, and that when it ended, she sat without moving for several seconds, and then said something quietly to herself in Indonesian, which I did not understand. I can tell you that the piece ended, and the room was silent for longer than concert hall silences usually last. Not the 4 seconds of the October ballroom, but longer, 8 or 10 seconds, which is an eternity in the context of a room waiting to respond to music. I can tell you that when the applause began, Mrs. Hendrewan stood with the rest of the room and stood for a long time. Fenwick was in the front row on the other side of the hall. I had noted him when we came in. He was in his seat throughout the concert, not working the room, not pressing flesh, not placing himself at the center of the social architecture. He was there as a member of the audience, which I suspect was not a role he had occupied for many years. During the Hendrewan piece, he did not move, not once, not to shift his weight, not to adjust his position, not to turn. I watched the back of his head for 12 minutes, and it did not move, and the quality of that stillness told me, as stillness in people always does, that the thing holding him still was not discipline, but attention. The deep, difficult, paying attention of a man who knows he owes it. When the piece ended, and the room stood, Fenwick was the first to his feet. Afterward, in the corridor outside the hall, Patricia pressed my arm and said, quietly, so that only I could hear, "She played it for him, didn't she?" "For the teacher." "I think she played it for herself," I said. "But yes, also for him." Patricia considered this. "Is there a difference?" I have thought about that question in the 2 years since. I think the answer is, not always, and not in the way we usually mean when we ask it. When you carry something for 20 years, a gift, a devotion, a discipline, a debt of love and music to a person who is no longer here to receive it, and you finally bring it to a room and set it down, the setting down is both things at once. It is yours, because you are the one who carried it, and it is his, because he is the reason it matters, and because the quality of what you give is inseparable from the quality of what you were taught. Marta played that music, but the music was also his. These are not contradictions. I have heard Marta play 4 times in the 2 years since the October evening. She performs now with a regularity that she determines herself, not on any terms that were offered to her by the arts world as a condition of its belated interest, but on her own, in rooms she has agreed to. She left the hotel's laundry department in January of the following year, on good terms and with considerable ceremony, and the hotel management, who had spent the interval between October and January discovering what the Alderton musical community had known for about 48 hours, handled the departure with a grace that probably owed something to institutional embarrassment and nothing at all to having seen it coming. The Brahms concerto is always in her program, always the first 2 movements, in the solo reduction, as she played them that October evening. She plays them the same way every time, with her eyes open, with her hands on the keys with the complete authority of someone who has been here before, and with a face that is composed and private, and fully, exactly, at home. I sit in the front row now, when I attend, so that I can see her hands rather than the back of her head. They are still the same hands, the calloused knuckles, the width across the palm, the slight asymmetry that comes from years at the pressing irons. Hands that tell the story of how a person spent their days, and which tell a different story entirely when they are on the keys of a Steinway in a concert hall in Alderton. I have stopped trying to reconcile these 2 stories. They are not 2 stories. They are one story, with a great deal in it. She played that October evening for 22 minutes. I timed it against a recording. 22 minutes, and 65 people who walked into a room, expecting one kind of evening, and walked out carrying something else. I cannot tell you what they were carrying, because I am only sure of what I was carrying. I was carrying the understanding that there are things in the world, skills, devotions, disciplines, the long accumulated fruits of love and practice and loss, that move through the world wearing ordinary faces, in ordinary clothes, with calloused hands, and that pass by you 50 times before you stop to look, and that when they finally choose to show you, when a woman sets down her linen trolley in a service doorway, and crosses a ballroom she was not invited to cross, and sits at an instrument she was offered as a joke, the only thing asked of you is that you have the decency to be changed by it. I was changed by it. I remain so. I drove home from the concert hall in March, along the ring road, and I crossed the bridge, and I looked up as I drove across it, at the arch of it, at the stonework, at the particular quality of craft that has held that structure over the Alderton River for nearly 100 years. It was late and dark, and there was nothing particularly visible, but I looked. I have looked every time I have crossed it since. I look because I learned, in a ballroom on the 22nd of October, that the looking matters, not because it changes anything in the bridge, but because the looking is the only honest response to the presence of a thing made to last. Marta Sundaram made something that October evening, in 22 minutes, that has lasted in me for 2 years, and that I expect to carry for the rest of whatever I am given. She played the music her teacher kept from finishing. She played it for him, and for herself, and she played it for the room, including, at the back of the room, the man who stood last. And what she made of those 22 minutes was something that had been waiting 20 years to exist in a room, and that needed, in the end, only the simplest possible invitation. The invitation of a man who thought he was offering a joke, setting a room up for a moment of gentle condescension, and instead, without any intention, without any understanding of what he was holding in his hands, opening a door. She played, and the room was never quite the same room again.